it's really interesting. I told my wife earlier today, you might be surprised by how I get things started, because I was starting to look at some of these things earlier this week. And says in the book of Revolutions and Revolutionary Movements, well, there was an author named James DeFronzo. He was a sociology professor from the University of Connecticut, very likely on the left end of the political spectrum. But he says that for revolutions and revolutionary movements to actually be effective, there are 5 key factors. Okay? 5 key factors in order for a revolution to be successful. One of them, the first one, is a mass frustration resulting in local uprisings. I don't know if we're seeing anything like that going on right now or anything, but or in recent history. But it says a large portion of society's population becomes extremely discontented, which leads to mass participation in protests, rebellions against state authority. In technologically limited agricultural societies, the occurrence of rural or peasant rebellions, or at least rural support for revolution, has often been essential. So, mass frustration resulting in local uprisings. The second was having a level of dissident elites. So these elites, these groups that have access to wealth or power of various types, or are highly educated, possess important technological or managerial skills, military equipment perhaps, pit some elite members against the existing government. Then number 3, they said powerful unifying motivations. The existence of powerful motivations for revolution that cut across major classes, unify the majority of a society's population behind this goal. Right? Again, these are some things that we've seen not just over there in Russia today, but things that we've seen at least attempted here in this country in the last 5 years, right? Powerful unifying motivations. Then it says number 4, a severe crisis, paralyzing state administrative and coercive powers. This was written back in like 2011, by the way. It says a state crisis occurs in the nation experiencing or about to experience a development of a revolutionary movement. The crisis, which may be caused by catastrophic defeat in war, natural disaster, economic depression, the withdrawal of critical economic or military support from other nations, or by any combination of these factors, may deplete the state of loyal personnel, legitimacy in the eyes of the public, and or other resources. The state then becomes incapable of carrying out its normal functions and cannot cope effectively with an revolutionary movement. And then number 5, he says a permissive or tolerant world context, where the other nations in the world don't intervene or don't try to prevent things from developing and succeeding. Isn't that just a little eerie to be talking about this today after the news of all of that? And it doesn't really take much, when you think about it, to reshape a movement or reshape a society. A recent study from 2018 was published in Science Magazine. I saw the report in Scientific American. It was titled, "The 25% Revolution, How Big Does a Minority Have to Be to Reshape Society?" It says, a committed few can influence the many and sweep away social conventions, new research shows. Doesn't take much. It says, this was kind of the opening paragraph. It says, this new study about the power of committed minorities to shift conventional thinking offers some surprising possible answers. Published this week in Science, the paper describes an online experiment in which researchers sought to determine what percentage of a total population of a minority needs to reach. What critical mass does there need to be to reverse a majority viewpoint? And the tipping point they found is just 25%. At and slightly above that level, contrarians were able to convert anywhere from 72 to 100% of the population to their respective group. Prior to the efforts of the minority, the population had been in 100% agreement about the original position. Apparently the way they did this is they had up different groups in different places online or whatever else. I don't know about the methods all that much, but they gave somebody a picture and they all agreed who that person was. And then they started inserting people into the group to say, oh, that's not this person, that's actually this guy. And how many people would it take for them to saying, no, it's this other guy, before they all started agreeing, hey, yeah, it is that other guy, right? So if you take pictures of two people that may look alike, like a famous actor and some random person that looks similar to him, they can all agree on the famous actor. It's like, no, really, that's this other guy, this impersonator, or whatever. There's the original Elvis, there's the Elvis impersonator, right? How much would it take for you to convince everybody in the group that the impersonator is actually the real thing? Something like that. So it says this is about a minority trying to change the status quo and succeeding by being unrelenting. By committing to a new behavior, they repeatedly expose others to that new behavior until they start to copy it. Again, these are things on multiple levels we're seeing in our country happening, right? It says another study reported on a BBC website from 2019 suggested that 25% was actually too high of a number. They called it the 3.5% rule, how a small minority can change the world. They were talking about nonviolent protests are twice as likely to succeed as armed conflicts, and those that engage a threshold of 3.5% of the population have never failed to bring about change, they said. In 1986, there were millions of Filipinos that took to the streets of Manila in peaceful protests. I've heard that term before, and in the People Power movement, and the Marcos regime folded on the fourth day. Y'all remember that happening? Some of y'all young people should remember that, right? Just go look up the number of shoes that Miss Imelda Marcos had. Everybody remembers that. She only had 2 feet. Yeah, you're right. So in 2003, the people of Georgia ousted Edward Shevardnadze through the bloodless Rose Revolution, in which protesters stormed the Parliament building holding flowers in their hands. In 2019, the presidents of Sudan and Algeria both announced they would step aside after decades in office. And they were looking at hundreds of different campaigns in the last century. And they say, although the exact dynamics will depend on many factors, all it takes is about 3.5% of the population actively participating in the protest to ensure a serious political change. In the United Kingdom, in England, it says 3.5% of their population would be about 2.3 million people actively engaged in the movement, which was about twice the size of their second largest city. In the United States, it would involve maybe around 11 million or 12 million citizens at most. That's more than the population of New York City, but is that really all that many? None of the recent attempts here in America from, if you Occupy Wall Street about 10 years ago or so with a BLM movement, neither of which attempted to be nonviolent, but the January 6th thing, none of those achieved anything like those kinds of numbers. Certainly not the kind of people really committed to the cause. But you have a small minority group committed to the cause have been successful. You think about the Bolsheviks in Russia in 1917, were actually a very small percentage, less than really 3.5%. They're mostly intellectuals that gain control of key elements of certain cities. What's that? It's always, yeah. Well, the communist takeover in China in 1948 and 49, was largely unknown to the majority of the country until it was over. The revolution leading to the Iranian Revolution in 79 was likewise pretty small in size, but the participants were pretty highly committed. And when you think about this, some of the things that I looked at no time in the American Revolution, says at no time did more than 45% of the American colonists support the Revolutionary War. And at least a third of them supported the British and fought for the British. Isn't that something? And the population of the colonies was only about 2.5 million at the time. The standing size of the Continental Army, they say, never exceeded 90,000 people, but some 250,000 men were fighting as far as the regulars, the militia, and different other groups. And they say that maybe about 10% of the population actually fought for the War of Independence on our side. You might increase that to 375,000, which is like 15%, and then you got to remember some of that percentage was fighting for the other side. That's something else to think about. When you think about it, with the number of about 2.5 million here in America, spread out over all of those 13 colonies, that's smaller than Israel coming out of Egypt. Isn't that something? But the Israelites had something that united them, something that gathered. They gathered around that central tabernacle. And that's such a significant thing when you came to Numbers chapter 16 and the opposition that came up to Moses. It says, now Korah, son of Izhar, son of Kohath, son of Levi, son of Reuben, Dathan, and Abiram, sons of Eliab, and On, son of Peleth, rose up against Moses and took 250 men from Bnei Israel, men of renown, who had been appointed to the council. Now that doesn't sound like much. How many? We're talking 5-6 million people. 250 men doesn't sound like much, does it? That's definitely not reaching the 25% or the 3.5% threshold, right? But it says these were men of renown. These are leaders. The word is actually for prince, nasi, one lifted up or elevated to this type of position. That the idea of renown is talking about they had a name, Shem. Men with a name, men with a reputation. Can men of reputation influence a lot of other people? Yes, they can. They were appointed, Korah, called or selected. They were summoned by name to the leadership role that they had been taken. You know, the first time this was used was in Numbers chapter 1, where it says, these were those selected from the community, princes of their ancestral tribes. They were heads of the thousands of Israel. That's that same word. So these were men of great influence and leadership. A lot of people looked up to them. These were that intellectual elites that were kind of mentioned earlier. They were at least of that caliber of people. And Korah was the one who was leading and directing this. What's interesting, though, at this point, I kind of feel sorry for Korah. Does anybody know what his name means? It means bald. Now, how do you get a name like bald? I was wondering about that and trying to figure that part out. Was he bald at birth? You know, that's not unusual, not having any hair at birth. Was it, prophecy that he was destined to become bald early in life? I feel sorry for him because, that's kind of what's happening. But was that a sign that he was just aged or respected? Was it a sign of wisdom or something else? But when you look at the word bald, in some way or another, it's associated with the idea of mourning. As if some would cut their hair as a sign of mourning and grief. And so, maybe was this a name that he carried from birth. Maybe he was born with no hair. Maybe his mother died in childbirth. Maybe he cut his hair in response to what had happened earlier in chapter 14, where the Lord comes out and declares that all these people that have been grumbling against me, refusing to go up into the land, they're not going to be allowed to go in. Right? Y'all remember that? Maybe it was grief for something like that. To have that kind of name, maybe he had a grievance of some kind. And that seems to be the case in some way. Tradition seems to suggest that with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob. Many understand they might have had a grievance because as part of that tribe, part of the firstborn tribe, the leadership was not coming to them. But when you look at those Aramaic Targums, they show something really interesting, at least as a possibility, that makes it a lot more personal against Moses. So this is one of those Aramaic translations. It says, "And Moshe arose and went to the remonstrate with Dathan and Abiram, and the elders of Israel followed. And he said to the congregation, Remove now away from the tents of these men of sin, who have been worthy of death from the days of their youth in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. For they betrayed my secret when I slew the Mitzrayite, the Egyptian." Isn't that interesting? And they provoked the Lord at the sea. So they were perhaps one of those that were, griping and complaining. Well, great, Moses, you've led us to the perfect spot to get corralled in and all killed. Right? At Alush, they profaned the Sabbath, and now they that gathered together against the word of the Lord. That's a lot more personal. Now, I don't know, if any of that is accurate or true, but that's at least the understanding that existed when in the really the first century era when these were written, that they were the ones when they were young that were turning Moses in for slaying the Egyptian. I thought that was pretty interesting. So they may have had a personal stake against Moses. And Moses may have remembered that these are the guys that have been causing me trouble for a long time. So many times when you look at things that rise up, opposition, all those types of things, that has a personal element to it. Right? Sometimes it's a matter of greed or a power of control. Sometimes it's a mix of all of the above. But for this movement of theirs to be successful, they'll have to get a lot of people on their side. And sometimes, it's God's people. We're usually pretty good at recognizing a threat, recognizing opposition when it comes from the outside, right? Other religions or other groups, Jehovah's Witness, Mormons, Islam, atheists, and the leftists or whatever else, right? We're good at recognizing when those kind of moments oppose the people of God. And Israel, they could too. They knew the Amorites, the Canaanites, the sons of Anak. They recognized their danger and the opposition. But what's the hardest ones to recognize are not the ones that come from the outside. It's the ones that come from the inside. The threats that come from within. Within the camp are the most dangerous, they're the most destructive, and the most painful. And that's how most congregations fall apart. If something's coming from the outside, we kind of all rally together, right? To push it away, to keep it away. We become more unified against a threat. But when a threat comes from the inside, from within, all of a sudden there's more divisions, there's more separation into sides, into rivalries, into resentments, as everybody picks a team, so to speak. We mentioned this last night. I said this last night. I am very thankful that we have hardly had any kind of incidents that would try to pull us and separate us. I am very thankful for the people that God has brought together. And if people have come and their intention was to start trouble, I think they figured out pretty quickly that it's not going to work. And I'm very, very thankful for that. We need to pray that continues. But within God's camp, that's not what we're seeing in this moment. What is supposed to be, we're not seeing it in this moment. We're not seeing it in most of our, history. What's supposed to be one new man as the people of God, a uniting of Jew and Gentile under Messiah. Have we separated from within along those lines? Yes, we have. And then within those groups, within the Gentile church, for example, has there been any division or have we all kind of stayed together on the same team? Think about that one if you haven't figured it out yet. But, division has split us up into thousands of different groups and denominations, divisions over theology, the nature of salvation, how to organize leadership, how to baptize, how often to do the Lord's Supper. You have sexuality, you have worship styles, you have the color of the carpet. All kinds of things have caused divisions like crazy. You name it, we've likely divided over it at some point or another somewhere. But despite all of the Gentile church's division, one thing has remained pretty consistent among almost all of them. Almost all of them have in some way challenged and rejected Moses and his place of an importance in the life of the believer in Messiah Yeshua. Y'all realize that's one thing that we have carried with us. No matter how many ways we've divided, we've kind of maintained and held on to that. And that's sad. We're doing exactly what Korah and his 250 were doing. From within the camp of believers, we have people making the same kind of charges, even against Moses, that Korah and his rebels did. Charges against Moses and even against us for doing what we're doing, right? Who want to keep the Torah as part of our walk with Messiah. Think about these accusations in light of some of the things that you've had said to you or things that you've heard over the years. Verse 3 of Numbers 16 says, "They assembled against Moses and Aaron. They said to them, 'You have gone too far. All of the community is holy, all of them, and Adonai is with them. Then why do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of Adonai?'" Has anybody heard things like that directed towards them? I have. You've gone too far. Moses is too much. Moses is too difficult, too controlling, too different, too legalistic. Right? You're pushing this Moses thing too much. You're just trying to earn your salvation by keeping the law. As one pastor in Georgia has said in the last few years, we have to do what? We have to divorce ourselves, separate ourselves from the Old Testament and get rid of all that stuff entirely. Moses asks too much from us. It's too hard. It's too difficult. His yoke is heavy and Yeshua's is light. Yeshua, he is the end of the law, which you've heard say, meaning that it's over and done, they say, right? He fulfilled the law, so there's nothing that Moses contributes to our faith. So if you want to keep that stuff, you've gone too far. Now, can Moses be all of those things in the wrong hands, under the wrong kind of teaching and implementation? Can implementing or talking about Moses be, too legalistic, too difficult, too controlling, too different? Absolutely. Is that Moses' fault or is that our fault? That's us. And we've all seen things go too far. Maybe in others, perhaps been in other congregations. Have you seen a congregation or a church torn up with legalism before? Yeah. Perhaps struggled with it in our own lives at times. Is it possible to go too far with Moses in our zeal and become, the Torah terrorist concept? Y'all have heard that one before? Yeah, it's possible to go too far. When we try to become an enforcer of all of our convictions and interpretations and our preferences, yelling, arguing, typing in all caps because they know you really mean it when you do that. Trying to make others keep the Torah exactly as you do. Many times this comes from maybe how we feel in coming to these perspectives, because many times people have gone through where they feel very betrayed by their pastors and teachers that you grew up with, and so oftentimes that there's at least a window, a period where many times we've been angry and resentful and all that kind of stuff. Y'all experience anything like that or seen that in others? Yeah, and those types usually go too far when they try to get everybody else to be right where they are. Right? But just because some do go too far with Moses and they become angry, become legalistic, doesn't mean that Moses actually is too far. Doesn't mean that Moses must be thrown out entirely. Moses and what he wrote in the Torah represents the law of the king and the kingdom. It's what's going to be governing his people during the millennial reign. That's that Isaiah 2 passage that we look at a lot, where Torah goes forth from Zion. The Torah is what is supposed to govern the hearts of his people. After all, it's the Torah that's supposed to be written where? Right in here. And that's only possible now that we have received a heart of flesh in the new covenant, according to Jeremiah 31. One of the most important roles of the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, in the life of the believer is to give us that heart of flesh, one that can be written on, and it's one that the Spirit who helps us to do what? To obey and keep His commands. He will cause us to walk in His laws and keep His rulings and do them. That's Ezekiel 36. And so if we love Him, if we love Yeshua, what do? We keep His commandments. And is there any conflict between Yeshua's commands and the commands of the Father given to Moses? No. Right? Yeshua himself even said that. Yeshua answered in John 14, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word. My Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our dwelling with him. He who does not love me does not keep my words, and the word you hear is not mine, but whose? The Father's who sent me." Right? Is Yeshua going to say something different than his Father? No. He goes on in chapter 15, right? "If you love me, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his." Is Yeshua keeping the Father's commands? So, because Yeshua got to kept Moses' commands perfectly, that means we don't have to, right? We don't have to worry about it, right? Is that what that means? Or is he saying, I've kept them, and, you should as well? He goes on in verse 14, "You are my friends if you do what I command you. I am no longer calling you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. Now I have called you friends, because everything I have heard from my Father I have made known to you." And why would he bother making them known to us if he doesn't want us to do any of them? Right? It is not going too far to say that we should be following the Torah. We don't seek that to be saved, that part is right, but because we are saved and because we love him. We love our Messiah, and so we follow his ways. And those who speak against Moses do so for a similar reason. We should not be speaking against him. What Moses says, but we do it for a similar reason as the second charge that they make. It says, "All the community is holy, all of them, and Adonai is with them." On one hand, is that part true? Yeah, it is. All those who believe have been called out and set apart. It was true of Korah and all of the people of Israel. They had been called out from the nations. They had been set apart for God's unique plan and purpose. Believers in Yeshua, are we called out from the nations as well? Yes, we are. They are made holy. They are set apart. We are set apart by the blood of the Lamb. Our sins have been forgiven. We have been justified before God. We are declared not guilty, right? We are holy. All of that is true. But does that mean that we don't need Moses? See, the implication is, hey, look, we're all holy. We don't have to follow all of these commands and all these things like you're telling us to. It doesn't mean, even though we are holy and justified before Him, that it doesn't mean that we don't need His writing. It doesn't mean that we don't need His Torah, need the Torah to work in our lives. Just because we are saved and justified, does that mean we've got nowhere else to go? No other growing to do? Do we not need to be concerned about conforming our hearts, our minds, our actions to God and His ways? Yeah, even though we are made holy, even though we are declared and saved and justified before Him, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in us. We are holy and justified, and at the same time, we are being made holy through sanctification. That's what the blessings say. You know, He makes us holy through His Word, right? Through the Scriptures. We know what sin is because what was started with the Torah through Moses. We experience conviction when we read Moses, don't we? We should. We know what pleases God, right? Through the reading of the Torah. As the Jerusalem Council said in Acts chapter 15, we're supposed to be in the synagogue hearing what? Hearing who? Hearing Moses. Because Moses is supposed to be read, every Shabbat. All the community is holy, all of them, and Adonai is with them. When is Adonai most with us? Is it when we disobey or when we obey? He is most with us when we obey. That's one of the lessons over and over again in the Scriptures, that Adonai does not go with the Israelites when they are in disobedience to Him, when they are going when He tells them not to go. They experience defeat after defeat when He doesn't go with them. Why should we, as God's people, expect to have victory and the Lord's presence if we're not obeying His Word? So it's a partial truth, but it's not the whole truth. Then that third accusation he has in here is, then why do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of Adonai? Y'all, anybody heard this one before? Well, you just think you're so much better than us because you don't eat pork. Anybody heard that one? You think you're so spiritually superior. Now, I've met people that do think that. But they're looking at Moses and saying, you think you're so superior, you think you're so much better than the rest of us common folk. You keep the Torah, so you think you're better. You think you're more spiritual. You think you're more holy. You think you're closer to God. You think that because you don't eat all this stuff or whatever else, you think you're better. Right? And again, I have come across people with that type of attitude, and I'm sure you have as well. It's not that it's impossible. But is that how we are supposed to be? Is that the kind of attitude that we're supposed to have in walking this walk? That look how much better I am more superior spiritually than you are. Is that what we're supposed to have? No, not at all. I mean, how many people do you think you're going to get to join in with you in keeping Torah if you have that kind of attitude? You're not going to get many people to come along with you. And that's supposed to be one of our major goals. Now, we are supposed to pass on and teach what God has shown us. And we can't always be responsible for how somebody responds when you talk to them about this kind of stuff, right? Because some make the accusations. Some people make accusations like this because of other things that are going on in their lives. Maybe some resentments, maybe some anger issues, or maybe because they even feel conviction. Right? But we must not be arrogant or obnoxious about the kind of life that he has called us to, because we are not really elevated above everyone else. We are not more saved, but the Father, through the Spirit, through the Ruach, has shown us something that everyone needs to know, something that everybody needs to be taught, something that they need to be shown, even if it's different from what they heard growing up. Right? Most of us came to these perspectives not as children. We didn't grow up in this. We had to be shown it. We had to have our eyes opened. We had to have maybe somebody speak to us, somebody teach us in order to understand this stuff. And we need to be willing to do that ourselves to others, because Torah is our future, right? A perfect Torah that gives freedom, enforced by a perfect king, not us, because we're not very good enforcers of these types of things, but enforced by a perfect king. The Torah in the flesh is what life in the kingdom is going to be, and it's not arrogant to encourage others to do what God has said to do. It's not arrogant to call people to a different life. That's what this is supposed to be from the very beginning for us. Then you see the last set of accusations that come against Moses start in verse 13. He says, "Isn't it enough that you brought us from a land flowing with milk and honey, only to kill us in the wilderness, and now you would lord it over us?" That is an amazing and perfect example of a term that we've heard lately. How many of y'all have seen the word gaslighting anywhere? Anybody heard that lately? How many of y'all know what that means? You hear it a lot, but it's like they never necessarily explain it. Right? Here's a Webster's definition of that thing. It says, a psychological manipulation of a person, usually over an extended period of time, that causes the victim to question the validity of their own thoughts, their own perception of reality or memories, and typically leads to confusion, loss of confidence, self-esteem, uncertainty of one's emotional or mental stability, and a dependency on the perpetrator. That's a big fancy definition, right? Basically, it's like you see something happen, you see an event happen, and they say, no, that's not what happened at all. This is actually what really happened. It comes from a movie from out in the early 40s. They did a couple of remakes of it where a man was manipulating his wife because he would dim the lights in his house, the gas lights in his house. Every night he would turn them down and make them dimmer, and then try to convince her that, no, this is the same as the way it's always been like this. What's your problem? Right? No, nothing's changing. This is bright light. What are you talking about? And it caused her to start questioning, well, maybe something's wrong with me because I'm not seeing, it's not right. It's like going outside and having somebody tell you that, no, the sky's always been green. Right? But look at what they say about their experience. Read that passage again. Isn't it enough that you brought us from a land flowing with milk and honey? That is gaslighting to the core. Really, was Egypt all that great? That's what he's claiming. All of a sudden, Egypt was this great place. You guys are just remembering a couple of bad things, a few things that happened here and there, but it was really good most of the time. It was the real land flowing with milk and honey. Our lives were great there. Now, here's the flip side of things. It might have been a great experience for Korah. Some traditions will suggest that he was actually a high-ranking person, an accepted person in Egyptian society, which that might be the explanation for his bald head. Because that's one of the things that the Egyptians often did, is they would shave their head so they could wear those different headdresses and those wigs and things like that. He might have been so highly ranked within their society that he wore one of those himself. So was it flowing with milk and honey for him? Yeah, it very well might have been. But not for everybody else. And he is trying to convince everybody else that Egypt was great, that their previous life was so much better than the life that they currently had in the wilderness, where Moses is the one just trying to control them, lord it over them. Much better than where they were actually going, right? Because what did the spies come back and told them? Yes, the land is flowing with milk and honey, but what? There's giants in that land. All the cities are fortified. It's going to consume us. It's going to eat us. Our wives and our children, they're all going to be dead within a week. Right? See, Moses helped lead them out of Egypt, out of that captivity, just like Yeshua has led us from a life of sin. But far too many people who claim the name of Messiah seem to think that their lives were better off the way they used to be. Before they even met Yeshua, before they had to start changing things about their lives, giving up certain things to follow him. Read this. This is a passage from 1 Corinthians. Read this passage with Egypt is so much better as the mentality. If you're assuming that Egypt is better, read this. He says, "Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Don't be deceived. The sexually immoral, idolaters, adulterers, those who practice homosexuality, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, slanderers, swindlers, none of these will inherit the kingdom of God." It says, that is what some of you were. But it says, if you met in meeting Yeshua, he's having the same experience that they had with Moses. You were washed, you were made holy, you were set right in the name of the Lord Yeshua, the Messiah, and by the Ruach of our God. Yeshua delivered us from all of that, from this kind of life. The Torah of Moses is supposed to help replace our old life and those old practices with a new life and a new practice. But it's as if people are looking at what Yeshua has done for us and how he has changed us and looking back on what we were and saying, boy, this was such a land flowing with milk and honey. My life was so much better when I had that. That's what Korah is trying to convince everybody of. And when believers reject Moses and what Yeshua intends, because is all of this stuff in Moses as saying, don't do this, don't live this way? Everything on this list are things that Moses said that's not supposed to be a part of the people of God. And so when believers reject Moses and what Yeshua intends Moses to bring, it's as if they are saying that their previous lives of immorality, idolatry, adultery, and all the rest was better. You cannot claim freedom from Egypt in Messiah while still preferring to live like an Egyptian. You cannot claim freedom from Egypt by the salvation of Yeshua, by all of this, while still preferring to live as an Egyptian. Moses, he's that first redeemer of God's people, as foreshadower of Messiah Yeshua. He was accused of saving them from a better situation. Now, if it was a better situation, why would you need to be delivered from it at all? And also, they go on to demean the promises of God in the future, claiming that Moses hasn't actually done anything about what's coming. He says in verse 14, what's more, not only was it better in Egypt, what's more, you haven't brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey. Moses, it's your fault that we didn't go into the promised land. Is that how things transpired? Was it Moses' idea? It's like, guys, I brought you all the way up here to the promised land, but I don't think you're good for that. I think we need to go over here for 40 years or so. It's my idea. You can put it all on me. I'll take us over here. Is that how it worked? Is he gaslighting again? Trying to rewrite history? Yes, he is. You have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor have you given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. What's he really interested in? He's interested in the wealth that would bring, the inheritance of fields and vineyards. Would you now gouge out the eyes of those men? Would you now, you're saying that we didn't see what we thought we saw, right? Our lives would be so much better, Moses, if you weren't the one leading us, that you haven't made our lives any better. These promises have not been fulfilled, so we should not be following you anymore. All your rules, all your laws, all your specifics of worship and belief, all those little things that you made us do and made us build. What's really fascinating about looking back at the Targums, what they say this whole argument and debate started with was over the tzitzit. Because just doing them any way that they wanted to do them. When you look at how Numbers 16 opens from the Targum, and of course Targums add some commentary. That's where we're getting some of this stuff. He says, this is part of that beginning. It says, Moshe had said, I have heard from the mouth of the Holy One, whose name be blessed, that the fringes are to be of white with one filament of hyacinth, one filament of blue or purple, however that happens to be. Oh, but Korah and his companions made garments with their fringes, what? Of all blue. They wanted to do it his own way. He was making tzitzit all blue with not just the single strand. Because after all, if one strand of blue is good, then more blue must be better, right? But who set that standard? Who made that command and that rule? God did. It wasn't even Moses' idea. God set the pattern, and he asked his people to obey it. He never gave them any condition or any situation or any authority in which it's okay to change his pattern. Because the pattern, in ways that we may not understand, means something to the Father. Without the pattern, without the obedience to even something like the tzitzit, in the same way that Moses was obedient to the pattern for the tabernacle that was shown to him, right? He went up on the mountain, he saw the blueprint, essentially, the pattern for the tabernacle. What if Moses says, well, I really don't want to make it that long. I'd really rather make it like this, or I'd rather really make it this color. Instead of having 70 stands or whatever it is, maybe if I do just 65. He's not going to care that much, right? The idea that all of this started because of a complaint like that. It can lose the meaning that testifies, and in doing it, even the little things, the small things, if we are unfaithful in the little things, what does Yeshua say? You're not going to be faithful in the big things. And if you do prove faithful in the small things, what does that show? That you are faithful and that you might be in a position to receive greater responsibility, greater things, right? Even doing something like, instead of one strand, making all the strands blue, that was a testimony to his disobedience and our breaking of the Torah. But Korah, like those speaking against Moses today, they act as if their life was better before being made a part of the people of God. They talk as if their life that they've been called to is not as good as the one that they left, and they don't think it's going to be getting any better. And that's not the promise or the pattern that Moses was laying out for them, nor especially of the pattern of Messiah, to whom Moses is pointing us to. Remember that without Moses, if we're listening to those who accuse him, and ignore him, then we're not really going to be able to recognize who Messiah is. We don't know who the qualifications. We don't know what Messiah is supposed to do. Without the Torah, anybody could claim to be the Messiah. And haven't they? But if we really believe Yeshua is the Messiah, then we would believe what he had to say about Moses. Because we find salvation in Messiah Yeshua by listening to Moses. Because Yeshua never spoke against Moses, never spoke against the Torah, but elevated Moses' place of influence because Moses points us more and more to him. That's John. He says, you search the scriptures because you suppose that in them you have eternal life, but it is these that testify about me. Right? Or do not think that I will accuse you before the Father. The one who accuses you is Moses, right? Because that's how, it's the Torah that tells us and defines what is righteousness. It's the Torah that defines what is sin, right? It's the breaking of the Torah. The one who accuses you is Moses, in whom you put your hope. For if you were believing Moses, you would believe me, because he wrote about me. But we have too many people, far too many churches that teach this. Since you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? Why is evangelism failing? Why is the church not growing the way it should? It's because they don't really believe what Moses had to say. And because they don't really believe what Moses had to say, they're not really going to believe in anything that Yeshua had to say either. Those things are connected. In rejecting Moses, they're just like the people in the Haftorah portion when asking for a king. They're not really rejecting Samuel. They're not really rejecting Moses. They're rejecting God. And we have to be careful not to be making the same mistake. We have so far too many people who are. God goes on and confirms, the place, the anointing of Moses by, accepting his offering of fire and rejecting theirs. He opens up the ground and swallows those who sought to overthrow him. He caused Aaron's rod to bud, to mature almonds overnight. God confirmed every step of the way that what Korah was doing and the rebellion he was leading was not the right path for the people of God. And so rather than rejecting Moses, we should stand with Moses. And so better know and follow the one that he was writing about all along. That's our Messiah.